Okay, a bit more of an unusual one this week. You might notice this fine specimen of a bike in front of me here. This is a 1993 Diamondback Sorento. Why have I got this? Well, this week is our Freak Week, doing a whole bunch of weird and wonderful things. But the point is, I was asked to buy a second-hand bike, one for myself, one for Blake and one for Neil. I picked this bike up for 125 quid. It's a bit of a bargain and it makes an ideal runaround bike. Of course, I don't really fancy riding into town on my expensive Canyon or Nuke Proof and locking them up despite how good locks are. So this is actually going to become a bit of a commuter bike for me as well. So it's a really good thing for any of you to buy at home, buy a second-hand bike just as a rat bike, running around sort of thing. And when you do buy one, I'm going to just show you all the safety things you need to check out on your bike and how to see if it's in good condition or not. Now, the way I always learned this working in bike shops growing up was working from front to back. It doesn't matter what your method is, but just make sure you have an accurate method of working on the bike so you don't forget anything. As I said, I'm going to start up front, work to the back of the bike and run you through it. The first thing I'm drawn to is the tyre. So these are actually ancient Tioga Psycho 2 tyres. So that's a second edition of what wasn't a very good tyre to start with, unless you were John Tomac, of course. So amazingly, for the condition of it, the rubber is not perished. That's what you're really looking for on a tyre as old as this. You want to make sure it's not likely to fall apart. Inspect the sidewalls of the tyre as well. You just want to make sure they're in good condition. Of course, the tyre is fairly cheap to replace just for a runaround bike like this, so you don't have to worry too much, but it's nice to keep it as it is if you can. Then you want to be starting to look at the wheels. So have a run around, make sure that the wheel's not too buckled, doesn't move too much side to side or up and down, and make sure that the spoke tension is fairly even throughout the wheel. I mean, quite astounded at the condition of this bike just from looking at it, so it's going to be interesting to see what sort of things crop up as we look at the bike. But all of these spokes feel pretty good, and there is a bit of movement in that rim, but nothing too much. So unlike modern mountain bikes that have some kind of axle system in the front fork, it's just a simple quick release on this. So this is a stainless steel quick release lever, works on a cam system just to hold the front wheel in place. Make sure the lever is facing up or to the back of the bike. You don't want the lever facing out front because that could snag on stuff and undo when you're riding. Now, there are tabs on the bottom of the fork, so if the quick release does undo, you mean you've got a last ditch attempt, but don't rely on that. Just make sure you keep an eye on that. Now, if I spin this and I hold the fork, I can feel that there's no sort of vibration coming through from the front wheel. So that suggests that the bearings are quite smooth and there's no sort of play side to side. Whilst we're still at the front of the bike here, you want to look at the cockpit and make sure your handlebars are attached to the stem properly. So in this case, it's a 6mm Allen key bolt here attaching to the stem clamp. Make sure it's not over tightened. Make sure the bolt isn't corroded, that it's broken in any way. And of course, make sure the bars are nice and straight and there's no cracks in them. On this particular bike, you've got some Altus 4-finger brake levers here. These are monsters compared to what you're used to nowadays, but just make sure they're in place properly and the barrel adjusters haven't sort of broken off them, because you do need that when adjusting the brakes. Something that does make me laugh on this is, firstly, it's got a pair of Yeti handlebar grips on there, quite expensive considering the caliber of this bike, and also it's got a Shimano group set on the bike, but whoever owned this bike previously has put some Sachs thumb shifters on. The rear one is indexed, as you would imagine, but the front shifter is not. It's a friction-based one, which means there's no spring pulling the front mech to either direction. You're just using the cable tension, but it means it's infinitely adjustable as well, which is quite a good thing, because if anything bends on the ride, you can sort of change the gear just to sort of make sure nothing's dragging. So as I explained at the beginning, the fork and the whole front end of the bike is very different to what a lot of you are probably used to. Older style systems like this, far less reliable, a lot heavier, a lot clunkier, and do require a lot more maintenance. And if run loose, you can actually destroy the bearings quite easily. But this particular one actually feels pretty good, so I've got high hopes for this. Now, on top of the steer tube that's welded onto these forks, there's some threads. So there's a bearing here, just like on a traditional headset that you know, and then a bearing at the top, but the difference is there's a threaded nut here, and that screws onto the top of the threaded steer tube and compresses it together. Now, on some headsets you had two nuts, a lock nut and then a tightening nut. This just seems to have a single nut, so it's going to require a bit of fine tuning for that. The stem itself has a quill design, so unlike the lightweight stems you see that clamp onto the steer tubes, this one has a big quill that goes on the inside, and it has a wedge that when you tighten the Allen key bolt on the top, it draws it up and it expands inside the steer tube. Now, the thing with those wedges is they can, with corrosion and road salt and stuff, pretty much bond to the inside of the fork and become stuck in there. Or the opposite is they never manage to grip tight enough so the stem can actually move quite easily. So you really want to pay attention to that because that's for your own safety. At the same time as checking the fork, making sure it's nice and straight, cast your eye over all of the welds on the bike, and what you're looking for is corrosion or any signs of the welding itself being cracked. And again, the tubes as well. You want to make sure everything is straight, stiff, and not sort of corroded or cracked and damaged. So something else that's going to cause you problems, if anything, on a bike of this age, it's going to be the sort of cranks and bottom bracket area. So if these cranks are not tightened sufficiently on the axle itself is a square taper. So if the cranks aren't butted up properly against the taper, they work their way loose. And the crank itself on the inside, because it's made of a softer material than the bottom bracket axle is, will actually sort of deform slightly, and you'll never be able to tighten the crank properly again, and they'll creak and come loose every single ride. Any rider in the 90s will be familiar with that absolute pain. So just make sure you look after them. As long as they're tight, they're gonna last you. So on an old bike like this, you want to be making sure that you don't have to replace the whole transmission, otherwise it defeats the point of buying a cheap bike. And I just checked the chain on this, and interestingly, there's not even that much wear. It's got about half the amount of wear I would have thought a bike of this age would have. And again, the rear cassette looks okay, and the gears generally work really well. The mech is straight and the hanger is straight. But you just want to make sure you check all of these things before you buy the bike. So unlike the more traditional brakes you see these days, which will be disc brakes and in some cases V-brakes, the traditional cantilever brake has quite a lot more adjustment on it. And one of the biggest things you need to pay attention to is the arc of the pads. So in this case, the rear left pad here is actually contacting the tyre sidewall. Obviously that's going to wear out your tyre sidewall and it will give you a puncture or a failure of some kind. So it's really important to make sure they're secure and tightened. Now there are two types of cable set up on these as well. There's the more traditional version, which has a cable straddle here. Now there's a single cable that passes across the brakes, and then a single brake cable that comes down to the straddle and bolts onto it. In this case, it's got the Shimano system with the little yoke here, so the cable from the lever passes through the yoke and straight to the brake, and it has a built-on cable just for making sure you can undo the brakes to release the wheel from the frame. Again, this is another thing well worth checking, because if that's frayed, your brake fails, you ain't got any brakes. So the last things to check on this bike is the rear axle to make sure it's tight and in place properly. You want to check the bearings to make sure nothing's loose or rattly. So there is quite a grindy feel to that, but nothing's loose and it goes round. I suspect that the bearing surfaces, due to the age of the bike, are just pitted slightly. So that happens if something's been over tightened or just ridden until it's absolutely done. Hopefully my rundown on buying a second-hand bike like this trusty old Diamondback that I've got here has been pretty helpful for you. At the very least, you're going to take away some points on some different componentry that is not that common these days. If you want to find out about buying a second-hand bike, click down here. Pretty useful video there on all the things you should look out for and how to spend your money wisely. And if you want to see another retro bike, check out the ProFlex down here that Neil's done. That is a seriously cool old bike. Of course, as always, please click on the middle to subscribe. Brand new content every day, and of course if you like the video, give us a thumbs up.